Good day, students. Welcome to this JSS 1 Social Studies lesson on the transatlantic slave trade. This is one of the most important and most painful chapters in Nigerian and African history. The transatlantic slave trade was the forced transportation of millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries. It devastated the populations and economies of West and Central Africa, including the peoples of what is now Nigeria. Understanding this history is essential for understanding Nigeria's development, the African diaspora, and the legacy of racism and inequality that continues to shape the world today. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain the origin and nature of the transatlantic slave trade, describe Nigerian people's roles as both victims and participants, describe the effects of the slave trade on Nigeria, explain abolition, and identify the legacy of the slave trade today. Let us begin. What was the transatlantic slave trade? The transatlantic slave trade, or also called the triangular trade, was the commercial system through which European powers, particularly Britain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and Spain, transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to work on plantations in the Americas, the Caribbean, Brazil, North America, and in domestic service and mining. The triangular trade. Leg 1, Europe to Africa. European ships carried manufactured goods, guns, cloth, alcohol, metal goods, to West African ports, traded for enslaved people. Leg 2, Africa to Americas. The Middle Passage enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, packed into ships, chained, with high death rates, 10 to 20% mortality during the voyage. Known as the Middle Passage, the most feared and deadly leg. Leg 3, Americas to Europe. Ships returned to Europe carrying New World commodities, sugar, from Caribbean plantations, tobacco, Virginia, cotton, American South, gold, silver, produced by enslaved African labor. Scale. Estimates suggest 12 to 15 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic between 1500 and 1867. Many millions more died in raids, during the journey to the coast, and aboard ships. This represents the single largest forced migration in human history. Nigerian peoples affected. Yoruba, captured during Oyo Empire Wars and the later Yoruba Civil Wars, sold through Badagry and Lagos. Large Yoruba communities formed in Cuba, Lucumi/Santeria, Brazil, Candombo, Trinidad and Tobago. IGBO, captured and transported primarily through Calabar, Old Calabar, Efik traders, and Boni, King People's Boni, Ijo traders. Large Igbo diaspora in Virginia, USA, Jamaica. Igbo landing legend, mass suicide of captured Igbo in 1803 rather than submit to slavery, and the Caribbean. Hausa, Fulani, captured in raids and wars in the north, some transported via North African routes. Internal/trans-Saharan slave trade also continued. IBO landing, 1803, a documented event where approximately 75 newly arrived enslaved Igbo people in Georgia, USA, drowned themselves rather than accept slavery, a profound symbol of resistance. African participation in the slave trade. Uncomfortable but essential history. African rulers and merchants actively participated in the slave trade as suppliers. Benin Kingdom sold slaves to Portuguese merchants from the 1480s. Oyo Empire, Oyo conducted wars specifically to capture slaves for sale through Dahomey, one of the largest suppliers in the 18th century. Boni Kingdom, Ijaw, Niger Delta King Pepo and successive Boni rulers became the wealthiest slave trading state in eastern Nigeria. Boni exported 20,000 slaves per year at its peak. Efik traders of Calabar, Old Calabar used the EKP's secret society to control trade and enforce contracts, supplied slaves to British and Dutch traders. Key point: African participation does not exonerate European slave traders or reduce European historical responsibility. Europeans created the demand, European guns and goods funded African raids, Europeans transported, bought, and profited on a massive industrial scale from enslaved people. African participation was smaller in scale and often enabled by European weapons and economic incentives. Effects of the slave trade on Nigeria/Africa. Demographic devastation, the loss of 12 to 15 million working-age people, predominantly young men and women, massively weakened African societies over 3 centuries. Political instability, wars conducted specifically to capture slaves increased interethnic violence and destroyed social trust. The Yoruba civil wars and collapse of Oyo were partly driven by slave trade dynamics. Economic underdevelopment, rather than developing internal industries and agriculture, many coastal states oriented their economies around slave raiding and trading, neglecting productive economic development. Gun culture, European guns traded for slaves changed the nature of African warfare. Guns proliferated and increased the scale and lethality of conflicts. Psychological legacy, racial dehumanization of Africans by European slave traders, the argument that Africans were inherently inferior, subhuman, or suited to slavery, formed the ideological basis for racism and colonialism. Diaspora creation, the African diaspora in the Americas, African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Caribbeans, estimated at 140+ million people, is the direct demographic legacy of the slave trade. Abolition of the slave trade. Quakers and British abolitionists, led by William Wilberforce in Parliament, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. 1807, British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, abolishing the British transatlantic slave trade, though not slavery itself in British colonies until 1833, Slavery Abolition Act. Royal Navy West Africa Squadron patrolled the West African coast to intercept slave ships, freed thousands of enslaved people, brought many to Freetown, Sierra Leone, which became home to freed slaves, including many Yoruba Sao who returned to Nigeria and played important roles in Lagos colonial society. 1833, Slavery Abolition Act, freed enslaved people in British colonies. 1865, USA abolishes slavery, 13th Amendment after Civil War. 1888, Brazil, last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. In Nigeria itself, Lugard's 1901 Slavery Proclamation for Northern Nigeria began the process of abolition in Northern Nigeria. Slavery, under various guises, persisted in parts of Nigeria well into the early 20th century. Legacy. African diaspora, Afrobeats, Rastafarianism, civil rights movement, BLM all trace roots to this history. Reparations debate, calls for financial reparations by former slave trading nations to African countries, ongoing international debate. Bedigre, Lagos State, the slave trade route and point of no return, a heritage site where enslaved people were embarked onto ships, now a museum and tourist site. Bedigre is one of Nigeria's most important historical sites related to the slave trade. 3 examination questions. Question 1. Describe the triangular trade and explain each leg. The triangular trade was the 3-stage commercial route of the transatlantic slave trade. Leg 1, Europe-Africa. European ships left ports like Bristol, Liverpool, and Lisbon carrying manufactured goods, guns, textiles, alcohol, metal goods, to West African ports, Lagos, Bonny, Calabar, Bedigre. These goods were traded for enslaved people. Leg 2, Africa Americas. The Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, Caribbean, Brazil, Virginia. The voyage took 4 to 8 weeks. Enslaved people were packed into ships in chains with minimal food, water, and sanitation. Mortality rates were 10 to 20%. Leg 3, America's. Europe ships returned to Europe carrying plantation products produced by enslaved labor, sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, completing the triangle. Each leg was profitable, making the entire system economically self-sustaining for European merchants and shippers. Question 2. State 4 effects of the transatlantic slave trade on West Africa. A. Demographic loss, 12 to 15 million people, primarily young adults, removed from African societies over 3 centuries, severely weakening the productive population. B. Political instability, wars specifically conducted to capture slaves destroyed intercommunity trust, increased violence, and destabilized states. Yoruba civil wars, collapse of Oyo. C. Economic distortion. Coastal states oriented their economies toward raiding and slave trading rather than developing internal industries. Agriculture, and trade in legitimate goods. D. Gun proliferation. European guns, traded for slaves, changed the scale and lethality of African warfare, causing further instability. Question 3. Who was William Wilberforce and what was his role in abolishing the slave trade? William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833, was a British Member of Parliament and Christian evangelical who became the most prominent parliamentary champion of the abolition of the British slave trade. He was led to the cause by Quaker and evangelical Christian abolitionists in the 1780s. He introduced the abolition bill in Parliament multiple times from 1789 onward, facing fierce resistance from wealthy slave trading interests, West India lobby. After 18 years of campaigning, the Slave Trade Act was passed by the British Parliament in March 1807, abolishing the British transatlantic slave trade. Wilberforce continued campaigning for the abolition of slavery itself. He died in July 1833, 3 days after learning that the Slavery Abolition Act had passed Parliament, abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. His legacy, abolition, changed the course of West African history, ending the most devastating aspect of the British-African relationship. 3 common mistakes. Mistake 1. Saying Africans were the main organizers of the slave trade. The demand for enslaved labor was created by European plantation owners, European ships transported enslaved people, European companies, Royal African Company, Dutch West India Company, institutionalized the trade. While African rulers participated as slave suppliers, the scale, industrial organization, and ultimate profit-taking was overwhelmingly European. Both dimensions must be acknowledged, African participation and European primary responsibility. Mistake 2. Forgetting that the slave trade involved internal African slavery as well. The transatlantic slave trade existed alongside a long-established internal African slave trade and the trans-Saharan slave trade, enslaved Africans transported to North Africa and the Middle East. The transatlantic trade was distinct in its industrial scale and racial ideology, but slavery was already practiced in African societies before European contact, though on a completely different scale. Mistake 3. Saying slavery ended immediately when it was abolished in law. Abolition was a legal process that was slowly and imperfectly enforced. In Nigeria, slavery was not formally abolished until the early 20th century under British colonial rule. Informal bonded labor and domestic servitude persisted even longer. Abolition in law is not equal to immediate abolition in practice. Summary. Transatlantic slave trade, forced transport of 12 to 15 million Africans to Americas, 15th to 19th century, primarily by British, Portuguese, Dutch, French, Spanish. Triangular trade, Leg 1, goods to Africa, Leg 2, enslaved people to Americas, Middle Passage, high mortality, Leg 3, plantation products to Europe. Nigerian peoples, Yoruba, Oyo, Bedigri, Lagos, large diaspora in Cuba/Brazil, Igbo, Calabar, Bonny, large diaspora in Virginia/Caribbean, Igbo landing 1803. African participation, Benin, Oyo, Bonny, Efik of Calabar, all participated as suppliers. Effects, demographic loss, political instability, economic distortion, gun proliferation, diaspora creation, racism ideology. Abolition, William Wilberforce, British Parliament 1807, slave trade, 1833, slavery, Royal Navy West Africa Squadron, US 1865, Brazil 1888. Bedigri, Nigeria's slave trade heritage site, point of no return. For homework, A. Describe the Middle Passage and explain why it was feared. B. State 4 effects of the slave trade on Nigeria. C. Explain why June 10, 1807 is historically significant. Attempt a quiz on your LMS. We remember the past to build a better future, never again. Visit Litech Academy at academy.litech.com.ng. Until next time.